The morning Cole Mercer found Eliza Hart, he almost didn't ride that direction at all. He'd been meaning to check the eastern fence line for 3 days running, kept putting it off the way a man puts off anything that doesn't have an immediate consequence. The cattle were fine. The snow had held off through most of November, which was unusual enough that the old-timers in Hatchet Creek had been muttering about it since October, though old-timers muttered about everything, and Cole had long since stopped listening to them. He had 40 acres, a cabin that kept the wind out most nights, and a workload that didn't require anyone else's opinion to manage. That was enough. That had always been enough. He saddled his gray horse, Soot, at first light more out of habit than intention. He drank his coffee standing at the open door watching the sky turn from black to something closer to pewter, the kind of flat winter sky that didn't promise anything good. His breath made clouds. The horse stamped in the pen and Cole set down the cup and went. He took the ridge trail because the lower ground was soft, and he didn't want soot sinking to his hocks in mud. The ridge ran along the eastern edge of his property and then curved north where it met the remnant fence of the old Halloway parcel. Land nobody had worked in 6 or 7 years, scrubby pine and bunch grass, and not much else. Cole wasn't thinking about any of it particularly. He was thinking about the hinge on the barn door that kept sticking and whether he had enough dried beans to make it to the end of the month without a trip into town. He almost missed her. Soot slowed first. The horse's ears went forward and then sideways in that uncertain way that meant he'd caught something the rider hadn't yet, and Cole pulled up and looked. The post was maybe 40 yards off the trail, just inside the tree line where the Halloway fence began, and what was tied to it looked at first like a bundle of clothing someone had abandoned. Old rags. Trash. Cole squinted. Then the bundle moved. It was a small motion, barely a shift of weight, a tilt of the head, but it was movement, and Cole had spent enough years in country like this to know that movement meant life, and life in a place like this in weather like this meant someone was in serious trouble. He turned Soot off the trail and pushed through the snow. She had her eyes open when he got to her. That surprised him. He'd half expected to find someone unconscious, past reasoning with, but her eyes were open and tracking him as he climbed down from the saddle, and they were the clearest, most alert eyes he thought he'd ever seen on a person in that much obvious pain. Brown, almost black in the morning light. Watching him the way a wounded animal watches something approaching us, so not with trust, not with hope, but with a kind of exhausted calculation, weighing whether this new thing coming toward her was going to be better or worse than what had already happened. "Hey," Cole said. Not the most useful thing he'd ever offered a person. He crouched down in front of her and took in the full picture. The rope at her wrists, the coat she was clutching to her chest, the way her lips had gone the color of old wood. "Hey, look at me. Can you hear me?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was barely anything, scraped thin by cold and whatever she'd been through before the cold. "There's a baby." Cole had already seen the bundle pressed against her chest. He'd been avoiding looking directly at it because he wasn't ready to deal with what he might find. He made himself look now. The infant was wrapped in what had been a wool scarf, wound around several times, the ends tucked in. Small. Impossibly small, the way all newborns are when you're not expecting them. Cole reached out carefully and pulled back the edge of the scarf and put 2 fingers against the baby's cheek. Warm. Warmer than the mother, at any rate, though that wasn't saying much. "He's alive," Cole said. The woman let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the center of her, like releasing something she'd been holding for hours. "I kept him against me," she said. "I didn't know what else to do." "That's exactly right," Cole said. "That's exactly what you should have done." He got his knife from his belt and cut the rope. Her wrists were bad, red and raw and starting to purple at the edges where the blood had pooled and thickened. She didn't make a sound when he cut her free, but he saw her jaw tighten and her eyes squeeze briefly shut. He caught her arms before they could drop and brought them down carefully, slowly, rubbing circulation back into her hands with his own. Her fingers were stiff and unresponsive at first, then began to twitch. "Can you stand?" "I don't know." A pause. "Maybe." "We're going to try," he said. "My cabin's about 2 miles. Can you hold on to him if I put you on the horse?" She looked at the horse and then back at Cole, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, but a decision being made. "Yes," she said. "I can hold him." Getting her up took longer than Cole liked. She'd been tied there long enough that her legs had lost most of their usefulness, And the first time she tried to put weight on her feet, she went down hard and would have hit the frozen ground face first if Cole hadn't caught her. He held her up with one arm and didn't comment on any of it, just waited for her legs to start cooperating again. By the time they got her into the saddle, it had cost both of them something. Her face had gone white with effort, and Cole's shoulder was going to feel this tomorrow. But she was up, the baby clutched against her chest with both arms, and she was steady. Cole led Soot by the reins. He didn't ride. The horse didn't need the direction, and the woman didn't need the jostling, and walking kept Cole's blood moving. He took them back down off the ridge and onto the lower trail toward his property, moving as quickly as he thought was reasonable. She didn't talk. He didn't push. There would be time later for explanations if she wanted to give them, and if she didn't, that was her right too. He'd found a woman tied to a post in freezing weather with a newborn baby, and that was all he needed to know to make the decision to help. The reasons behind it were her business. He did ask one thing, about halfway back, because it seemed necessary. "What's his name? The baby?" She was quiet for a moment. "I haven't named him yet," she said. I wasn't sure there would be time." Cole nodded and kept walking. Ian. The cabin was nothing fancy, and Cole had never pretended otherwise. One main room with a fireplace that drew well, a small bedroom off the back, a lean-to against the south wall where he kept tools and supplies. He'd built it himself 8 years ago when he first came to this valley, and it had survived every winter since, which was the only quality he'd cared about. He got the fire going first. Then he got the woman settled on the cot he dragged close to the hearth. The bedroom was colder, and he needed the main room's warmth. She sat where he put her without complaint and held the baby with a focused intensity that told him she'd been holding on to that particular task as the one thing keeping her in motion. As long as she had to hold him, she had to keep going. Cole found his extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed and brought them out. He boiled water, not because he was entirely sure what he'd use it for, but because hot water seemed like the right response to most crises. And while it heated, he knelt in front of the woman and looked at her wrists again in the firelight. Worse than he'd thought on the ridge. The skin was broken in 2 places where the rope had cut through. Not deep, but in weather like this, in a situation like this, infections didn't need an invitation. "I'm going to clean these," he said. "It's going to sting." "I know," she said. "My name is Cole Mercer." She looked at him for a moment. "Eliza Hart." He nodded once and went to work. She had been right that she could handle the stinging. She sat entirely still while he cleaned and wrapped her wrists, her eyes fixed on the fire, the baby making small sleeping sounds against her chest. Cole kept his movements deliberate and calm because he'd noticed early that she startled easily. Any sudden movement from him pulled her attention sideways, her whole body going briefly rigid before she caught herself. He didn't comment on that either. It told him what he needed to know about the time before he found her. When her wrists were wrapped, he made coffee, real coffee, the last of what he'd bought in October, and brought her a cup. She held it in both hands and drank it slowly, and some of the gray came out of her face. "How old?" Cole asked, nodding toward the baby. 2 days, I think." She frowned slightly. "Maybe 3. The time has been difficult to track." "He was born before they—" Cole stopped. "Before they tied me to the post?" Her voice was even. Too even. The way people sound when they've had to say a hard thing enough times in their own head that saying it out loud no longer hits them properly. "Yes, 2 days before, I think, in a barn. There was a woman who helped, one of the house servants. She wasn't supposed to." Eliza looked down at the infant's face. "I don't know if she was punished for it." Cole waited. She seemed to make up her mind about something. Maybe she'd decided that the man who'd cut her free and carried her down a mountain in the cold had earned an explanation. Maybe she was just too tired to keep it contained. "My husband died in August," she said. "Thomas Hart. He was 20 years older than me, and we'd been married 4 years. I didn't marry him because I wanted to. My family needed the connection, and Thomas Hart had land and money and didn't particularly care whether I wanted to marry him or not." She paused. I'm not telling you this to ask for your sympathy. I'm just explaining the situation." "I understand," Cole said. "When Thomas died, his family, his brothers and his mother, began to claim that the child I was carrying wasn't his." She said it flatly, like reading from a document. "They brought in a doctor who agreed with them, though I have no idea what basis he could have had for that opinion, given that he'd never examined me before in his life. The timing of the pregnancy contradicted them, but they didn't particularly care about that. What they cared about was that if my child was Thomas's legitimate heir, that child would inherit a substantial portion of the estate. And if he wasn't, then everything went to them. She looked up from the baby, and her expression was tired in a way that went well past physical exhaustion. They told me I could sign papers agreeing that the child had no claim and leave quietly with whatever I'd brought to the marriage, which wasn't much. Or they could have me declared an adulterous wife and drive me out with nothing and my reputation destroyed. She looked back at the fire. I didn't sign the papers. Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing against the walls of the cabin with a low, steady pressure. So they chose option 2, he said. They chose option 2. She swallowed. I was 3 days from the nearest settlement when they had me removed from the property. The man who did it, I think he felt some small amount of remorse because he left me with the coat and the scarf. The others who came with him were not as considerate. The post was, I think it was meant to be a message, for anyone who might be traveling that road, that this is what happens to a woman who makes trouble. The fire popped. The baby shifted in her arms and made a small sound, and Eliza instinctively pressed him closer. Cole stood up and went to the window and stood there with his back to the room for a moment. He was not a man who felt things loudly. That had been true since he was a boy, and it had gotten more true in the years since. He kept things close and internal, processed them quietly, and did not make a show of whatever he was feeling. But standing there with his hand on the cold windowsill, he felt something very specific and very clear move through him, and what it was fury. He turned back around after a moment, and his face was composed and his voice was level. "You'll stay here," he said, "until you're well enough to make decisions about what comes next." Eliza looked at him steadily. "You don't know me." "No. I could be everything they said I was." "Could be," Cole agreed, "but I found you tied to a fence post with a 2-day-old baby in the snow, and whoever tied you there didn't have your interests at heart. So I'm not particularly inclined to take their word for your character." Something moved in her expression. Not quite gratitude, which was too soft a word, but something more complicated. Something that had to do with being surprised when you expected not to be surprised. "I'll need to earn my keep," she said. "We can discuss that later. Right now you need to sleep." She looked like she wanted to argue, and then the exhaustion caught up with her all at once, the way it does when you've been running on terror and will for so long that the moment those things ease off your body just collapses. Her eyes went heavy. She pulled the baby against her chest and lay back on the cot and was asleep within minutes. Cole put another log on the fire. He sat in the chair across the room and looked at the woman asleep on his cot, and the baby she'd kept alive by body heat through a night that would have killed both of them otherwise. He didn't sleep. He sat and listened to the wind and kept the fire and didn't sleep. But she was sick for the better part of a week, not dying. Cole had been worried about that, had spent 2 days checking her breathing every few hours with the focused anxiety of a man who had no idea how to manage what would happen if she got worse, but sick enough that she slept most of the time, hot-faced and restless, surfacing occasionally to nurse the baby and then dropping back under. Cole managed the infant during those periods, which was an experience he had not anticipated and could not say he was entirely prepared for. He'd been around babies before, neighbors' children, a nephew he saw twice a year, but he'd never been solely responsible for one, and the weight of it was different from anything he'd expected. Not the physical weight, which was nothing. The boy was hardly larger than a bread loaf. The weight of attention, the way newborns require everything to pause and orient toward them, the way a cry can reorganize an entire room. He learned quickly that when the baby cried there were 3 or 4 reasons, and he had to go through them in order. He learned that warmth worked faster than most things. He learned that if he held the boy against his chest and walked slowly, the rhythm of his footsteps was enough to quiet the crying within a minute or two, and he spent a great deal of that first week walking slow laps around the main room of his cabin in the middle of the night. He named the baby in his own head, privately and without announcing it, because someone needed to call the boy something, and Eliza was too sick to be asked. Cole settled on William and said it quietly to him a few times, just to see how it sounded. It sounded fine. On the 5th morning, Eliza woke up clear-eyed and knew where she was. Cole heard the change in her breathing and looked up from the table where he was working on a bridle strap. She was watching him from the cot. "How long?" she asked. 4 or 5 days. "The baby, he's fine. Sleeping." Cole nodded toward the cradle he'd rigged from a wooden crate and 2 blankets. "He's been eating. I've been bringing him to you when he needed it. Most of the time you woke up enough to manage." She lay still for a moment, processing this. "You took care of us," she said. "It wasn't complicated." "It wasn't nothing either." She sat up slowly, testing her body's response. Thank you. Cole set down the bridle strap. How are you feeling? Weak? She touched her wrapped wrists. Sore, but clearer. Better. She looked around the cabin with the careful attention of someone seeing a place properly for the first time. Her eyes moved over everything. The table, the stove, the tools hung by the door, the shelves with their organized supplies, with a precise, analytical quality. You live here alone. Have done for years. It's very orderly. Cole glanced around. He'd never thought of it as particularly orderly. It was just the way things needed to be so he could find them when he needed them. I suppose. She made a move to stand and he got up to help, and she accepted that without making it into anything. Just a practical matter of needing assistance and taking it. They got her to her feet and she stood for a moment with her hand on his arm, steadying. I want to see him, she said. He walked her to the cradle. She looked down at the baby for a long time without saying anything. He looks healthy, Cole said. He's been eating well, sleeps a decent stretch at night, all things considered. Eliza crouched down, carefully, with the movement of someone recalibrating their relationship with their own body, and reached out and put her hand against the baby's cheek the same way Cole had done on the ridge. The same instinct, the same checking to make sure he was real and warm and present. Did you name him? She asked quietly. Cole hesitated. I called him William. In my head. That was just to have something to call him. You can call him whatever you want. Eliza looked up at him. Something in her face shifted, opened briefly. William, she said, as though testing it. William Hart. A pause. He needs a first name people remember, not a family name alone. William's a first name. You're right, it is. She stood up carefully. William Hart. She said it again, settling it into place. That'll do. Cole thought it would do just fine, but didn't say so. The days that followed had a shape to them that Cole wouldn't have predicted. He'd expected awkwardness, the specific discomfort of two strangers forced into close proximity by circumstance, that painful process of establishing territory and routine when you weren't sure of the rules. He'd lived alone long enough that having anyone else in the cabin, man or woman, should have felt like a disruption. It didn't, quite. Eliza wasn't the kind of person who filled space unnecessarily. She didn't talk for the sake of talking, didn't ask questions she wasn't genuinely interested in the answers to, and didn't make her presence felt as an imposition. She moved carefully through the cabin the way you move through a borrowed space, with a self-consciousness about taking up room that Cole recognized from his own patterns. She had spent time learning to be small, he thought, to keep herself tucked in and unobtrusive. It was a skill you developed when being visible had cost you. She started helping as soon as she was steady on her feet. Not in any dramatic way. She just noticed what needed doing and did it, the same way she'd probably always worked. Cole came in one afternoon to find the dishes washed and stacked, another day to find his mending basket set out on the table with a needle already threaded. She didn't make a production of any of it or ask for acknowledgement. The first time she cooked dinner, a proper dinner, stew with the dried venison and root vegetables from his stores, seasoned in ways Cole hadn't thought to bother with. He ate it and said, "That's good." And she nodded, and they left it there. The compliment felt sufficient between people who didn't waste words. William grew into himself with the startling speed of newborns, which Cole found both relieving and unsettling. Each morning there seemed to be more of him, more expression, more opinion, more presence. His eyes tracked faces now. He'd developed a specific cry for hunger that was different from the cry for discomfort, which made things more efficient. Cole had a theory, developed over quiet observation, that William was going to be a serious child, the type who watched everything with an intense, focused curiosity. He kept this theory to himself. He did notice that he was paying attention to the child in ways he hadn't anticipated, checking on him when he didn't strictly need to, finding small tasks near the cradle so he'd be close if something was needed. He didn't examine this too carefully. It seemed like the reasonable behavior of any adult who was responsible, at least in part, for a small creature's survival. What Cole hadn't anticipated, what he had no particular framework for, was the evenings. After William was down and the fire banked and the day's work finished, there was a stretch of quiet that had always, before this, just been the end of the day. He'd sit with a book, or sharpen tools, or simply sit. It had been enough. Now Eliza sat in the other chair, mending or sewing or sometimes just resting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the fire. And the quiet had a different texture to it. Not uncomfortable. The opposite, which was harder to explain. They talked sometimes. Not always. He told her in pieces and without any real order about how he'd come to be in this valley, originally from Missouri, had moved west at 22 following something he couldn't precisely name, had found this land and put down roots without meaning to. She listened without interrupting. She told him things, too, over those evenings. About her family, respectable but struggling, which was why the Hart marriage had seemed like a solution. About Thomas Hart, who had been neither cruel nor kind, just deeply indifferent, which had its own particular wear on a person. About the 4 years of that marriage and what it had and hadn't been. She told these things with the careful, selecting quality of someone who had decided to share a thing but was still choosing what parts to share. And Cole respected the decision-making in it. One evening, about 3 weeks in, she said, "People in town are going to talk." "They already are," Cole said. She looked at him. "You know this? I went in for supplies last week. There was some commentary." He'd been into Hatchet Creek once since bringing Eliza home. A quick trip for flour and salt that had taken twice as long as it should have, because 3 different people had found reasons to ask him questions in that oblique way that meant they were asking about something else entirely. He'd answered exactly what was asked, and nothing more, and had come home. What kind of commentary? Cole considered how honest to be. He decided fully honest was simplest. "Some people think I should have left you where I found you. Some people think I should have brought you to town to be someone else's problem. A few people seem concerned about appearances." He set down the piece of wood he'd been working on. "None of it changes anything. I don't have a lot of use for Hatchet Creek's opinions." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "They'll say worse things when word gets further, when the Hart family hears where I am." "Probably. Does that worry you?" Cole thought about the woman he'd found on the ridge, the rope marks on her wrists, the way she'd held that baby through the night by sheer will. "No," he said, "it doesn't worry me." She looked at him for a long moment, and he had the sense of something being weighed and measured, some internal calculation being performed. "It worried everyone else," she said finally. "I'm aware of that." He picked up the wood again. She looked back at the fire. Outside the cabin, the wind moved through the pines with that particular hollow sound it made in deep winter, and the fire shifted and popped, and William made a small sleeping sound from the direction of the cradle. It was a quiet evening. Cole found that the word that fit it best was simply good. He didn't think too hard about that. There would be time enough later to think hard about things. For now there was the fire and the wind, and the work in his hands, and the small sound of the baby sleeping, and that was what the evening was. He went back to his work. Eliza sat by the fire, the cabin held against the weather the way it had been built to do. And outside, beyond the ridge, in the town of Hatchet Creek, and in the world beyond it, the trouble that had found Eliza Hart once was not done finding her. But that was for later. That night, at least, was quiet. The first real sign of trouble came from Margaret Aldous. Margaret ran the dry goods store on Hatchet Creek's main street, with the particular authority of a woman who understood that information was more valuable than inventory. She knew everything that moved through that town. Who was buying extra flour, who'd stopped coming in altogether, who was sending letters east. She had a gift for observation that she dressed up as neighborly concern, and she had been watching Cole Mercer's supply purchases with great interest since December. Cole noticed the shift on his second trip into town after bringing Eliza home. It wasn't anything said directly. Nothing in Hatchet Creek ever was. But the space people gave him at the counter was a little wider than it used to be, and Margaret's smile when she totaled his bill carried something careful in it, something that had an opinion tucked behind it. "Cold winter for traveling," Margaret said, wrapping the salt in brown paper. "It is," Cole said. "Must be difficult keeping a household running, a man alone." She set the package on the counter. Her eyes were pleasant and entirely watchful. "Though I suppose you're not so alone these days." Cole counted out his coins. "Is there anything else I need?" Margaret's smile stayed perfectly in place. "I just think it's interesting, is all. A young widow, a new baby, and no one knows quite where she came from. People wonder, Cole. It's natural. People can wonder all they like," he said. He picked up his supplies and left. But Margaret wasn't wrong that people were wondering. He could feel it in the quality of the looks he got walking back to where Soot was hitched. Not hostile, not exactly, but evaluating. The town had formed an opinion and was in the process of hardening it, the way wet clay hardens if you leave it long enough, until it becomes something you can't reshape without breaking it. He didn't tell Eliza about the conversation with Margaret. There was no useful purpose in it. She already knew the shape of what was coming. She'd named it herself, those evenings by the fire, and telling her the specifics would only give the worry more to hold on to. What he did instead was make a point of being seen with her. It wasn't a strategic decision, not exactly. It was more that when he needed to go into town the following week, he asked if she wanted to come, framing it as a practical matter. She knew better than he did what she might need, and she said yes, and that was that. He helped her up onto Soot's back, William bundled against her chest in a sling she'd fashioned from one of his flannel shirts, and they rode into Hatchet Creek together. The reaction was immediate and mostly silent, which was somehow worse than if people had said something directly. Heads turned, conversations paused. A woman Cole only knew by sight pulled her daughter a few steps closer as they passed on the boardwalk, which was the kind of gesture that didn't require explanation. Eliza saw it. She sat straight-backed on Soot and looked forward and didn't show anything on her face, which told Cole she'd had a lot of practice not showing things on her face. Inside the mercantile, while Cole dealt with supplies, a woman named Ruth Cantor, the minister's wife, who conducted herself as though this gave her jurisdiction over most things, appeared at Eliza's elbow with the focused intention of someone who had been waiting for this opportunity. "You must be the woman staying with Cole Mercer," Ruth said. She made it sound like an accusation wrapped in a pleasantry. "I am," Eliza said. Her voice was even. "And this is the baby." Ruth looked at William with an expression Cole couldn't quite read from across the room. "Yours and—" She let the end of the sentence hang. "Mine," Eliza said simply. "His name is William." "Of course." Ruth smoothed her gloves, a gesture she seemed to use as punctuation. "It's just that people do talk, you understand. A woman in your situation, living with a man she's not married to, you can imagine how it looks." "I imagine I don't need to," Eliza said. "I can see how it looks from where I'm standing." Ruth blinked. She'd probably expected either embarrassment or apology, and Eliza had offered neither. "Well," she said, recovering, "I only mention it out of concern, for you and for Cole. He's a respected man in this community." "Then the community should trust his judgment," Eliza said. Cole, who had heard all of this from 8 feet away, looked very carefully at the shelf of canned goods in front of him and did not smile. Ruth departed with a brisk nod and the air of someone reassessing a situation. Cole finished his business at the counter and they went back out to the street. "Ruth Cantor," he said. "I gathered." "She means well." He said it without particular conviction. Eliza looked at him sideways. "Does she?" He considered this honestly. "She thinks she does, which is close enough to the same thing that it doesn't help either way." Eliza made a small sound that might have been a laugh, brief and almost surprised, as though she hadn't intended it. It was the first time Cole had heard her laugh, and he found he was paying more attention to it than was strictly necessary. They rode back mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence from the one they'd started with. Something had shifted, very slightly, in the way they occupied the same space. Cole couldn't have named it precisely, and didn't try. The talk got worse before it settled into the dull hum of ongoing judgment that a person could almost stop hearing. Word had spread. Cole didn't know exactly how, though Margaret Aldous would have been his first guess, that Eliza Hart was a widow with a disputed child and a ruined reputation, who'd somehow ended up in Cole Mercer's cabin with no explanation the town found satisfactory. The versions of the story multiplied the way stories do when there's a gap in the facts that people feel entitled to fill. Some versions were merely unkind. Others were worse. Cole heard fragments when he went into town. Never directly, always at one remove, the passive voice of frontier gossip that allowed everyone involved to claim they hadn't said anything themselves. He let it pass through him without sticking. He had developed, over the years, a reasonably effective immunity to other people's opinions about his choices, built up through the same process as any immunity. Repeated low-level exposure until the body stopped reacting. Eliza did not have that immunity, not for this particular strain of it. She was good at appearing not to be affected. Cole noticed this about her, the way she could set her face and her posture into something that looked like indifference, the particular straightening of her spine that she did when something had gotten through her guard. He'd learned to read the tells. Not because he went looking for them, but because he was a careful observer of things he lived alongside, and she was one of those things now. He saw it one evening in late January when she came in from feeding the chickens. He'd acquired 3 hens from a neighbor's surplus the week before, a practical decision about eggs, and her face had that set quality to it, and she was quiet through supper in a way that had a shape to it. He waited until William was settled. "What happened?" he said. Eliza looked up from the mending she'd been doing with rather more force than mending required. "Dorothea Vance was at your fence line today. I was outside when she came by." Cole knew Dorothea Vance, mid-40s, sharp-tongued, whose husband had a parcel to the east. "What did she say?" "She asked me very politely how long I intended to take advantage of your hospitality." Eliza set down the mending. "She said the town was concerned about Cole Mercer's reputation, not mine, his, as though the greatest harm in this situation was to you." She paused. "She also said that a respectable woman would have found a different solution to her difficulties." Cole was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "I told her I hadn't asked for her assessment of my respectability, and she was welcome to direct any further concerns to me rather than discussing them at the post office." A beat. "I think I said it more politely than I'm saying it now." "That was probably wise." Eliza looked at him. Her expression was doing several things at once: tired, frustrated, and underneath it, something more uncertain. "Cole, do you want me to go?" The question sat between them with a weight that hadn't been there before. "No," he said. He said it without hesitation, without the pause that would have made it into something performative, just the flat, direct fact of it. She held his gaze for a moment. "These people are your community. I don't want to be the reason you lose standing with them." "I don't have much standing to lose," Cole said. "I've never been particularly popular in Hatchet Creek." "That's not the same as being actively gossiped about." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Eliza, when I brought you down off that ridge, I made a decision about what mattered here. That decision didn't come with an expiration date. If Dorothea Vance or Ruth Cantor or Margaret Aldis want to spend their time talking about what I should or shouldn't have done, that's time I'll never spend worrying about." She looked at him for a long moment. Something was working behind her eyes. That calculation he'd noticed before. That particular way she had of assessing things carefully before committing to a response. "I don't understand you," she said finally. Not unkindly, as a fact. "What part?" "The part where none of this seems to cost you anything." Cole sat back. He was quiet for a moment, honest with himself about how to answer. "It costs something," he said. "I just think the alternative costs more." That seemed to land in her somewhere. She picked up the mending again, but the set quality was gone from her face. She looked like herself again, sociale. Still tired, still carrying things, but less sealed against the world. "He smiled today," she said, after a moment. Cole looked toward the cradle. "Who did?" "William. A real smile, not the wind kind." She didn't look up from the mending. "I wasn't sure at first, but then he did it again. He looked right at me and did it again." "How old does that usually start?" "I don't know. I've never had a baby before." A small silence. It felt like something, is all." Cole looked at the cradle again. He thought about those first nights of walking slow laps around this room, the weight of the boy against his chest, the way the crying would stop and the house would go quiet again. "Yeah," he said. "I imagine it would." February came in with a cold that had a mean edge to it, the kind that wasn't just temperature but felt personal, like the season was trying to prove something. Cole's water pump froze twice, and he spent an unpleasant morning both times with boiling water and stiff fingers getting it working again, and the wood supply was going faster than he'd planned. He was doing a second round of splitting one gray afternoon when he heard Soot get restless in the pen. Not the mild restlessness of boredom or cold, but the specific alertness that meant something new was happening. Cole set down the axe and looked toward the trail. 2 riders. They came down from the north at a pace that was unhurried but deliberate, the kind of pace that says we've got the time and we know where we're going. Cole watched them for a moment, reading what he could at distance. Both men, both well-dressed for frontier travel, the kind of clothes that said they could afford to replace what the weather destroyed. The horses were good. These were not men who'd missed many meals. He picked up the axe again, not because he needed to split more wood, but because having it in his hand seemed like appropriate information to convey. They pulled up at the fence gate, and the taller of the two looked down at Cole with an expression that managed to be both polite and dismissive simultaneously, a skill that required practice. "Looking for a man named Mercer," he said. "Cole Mercer." "Found him," Cole said. The man's eyes moved briefly to the axe, then back to Cole's face. "I'm Gerald Foss. I represent the Hart family of Collier County. This is my associate, Mr. Beaumont." He said the Hart family with a particular weight, the way people say names they expect to produce a reaction. Cole had heard of the Harts. Most people in the territory had, at least by reputation. The family held land and money and influence across several counties, the kind of accumulated position that had existed long enough to start being called legacy. "What can I do for you?" Cole said. Gerald Foss looked toward the cabin. "I understand you have a woman staying with you, a Mrs. Eliza Hart." "I have a woman staying with me. What business is that of yours?" Foss smiled in the way that men smile when they want you to understand they're doing you a favor by smiling. "The Hart family has been concerned about Mrs. Hart's welfare since she left the family's care. We've been looking for her for some time. We simply want to make sure She left the family's care," Cole said. "Is that how you're calling it?" Foss paused. "I beg your pardon?" "The family's care." Cole set the axe head down against the ground and rested his hands on the top of the handle. "She left the family's care. That's an interesting way to describe what I found on the ridge 6 weeks ago." The two men exchanged a glance. Beaumont, the one who hadn't spoken, had a quality to his stillness that Cole had seen before, the specific stillness of a man who was accustomed to resolving disagreements through methods that didn't always involve words. "Mr. Mercer," Foss said carefully, "I think there may have been some misunderstanding about the circumstances." "There wasn't," Cole said. "But go ahead." Foss reset. He was practiced at this, Cole could see, accustomed to conversations that pushed back at him and trained to simply reorient and continue. "The family would like to speak with Mrs. Hart. If she's well enough to receive visitors, we'd appreciate the opportunity." "No." Foss stopped. "I'm sorry? She doesn't want to see you." Cole said it plainly, without anger, as though he were reporting a neutral fact. "She hasn't said so, but she doesn't need to. You can see the cabin from here, and you can see that no one's come out of it since you rode up, which means she's seen you and she's staying inside." "I'll take that as her answer." Beaumont shifted in his saddle. Foss's pleasant expression had gone slightly rigid at the edges. "Mr. Mercer, we're not looking for a confrontation. The Hart family simply has interests regarding the child. If there's a way to resolve this quietly and civilly—" "Here's what I know about quiet and civil," Cole said. His voice had stayed level throughout all of this, which he was paying attention to, because he could feel something large and heated moving underneath the level. "I found that woman tied to a post in freezing weather with a newborn baby. I carried them both home and kept them alive through a fever that could have gone the other way. And now 2 men in good coats have ridden up to my fence talking about the family's interests." He looked at both of them in turn. "You tell the Hart family that Eliza Hart is not their concern anymore. And if anyone from that family comes back to this property with any idea about the child, we're going to have a conversation I suspect no one will enjoy." Foss looked at him for a long moment. He was calculating. Cole could see it, running through his options, deciding whether this was a situation that called for escalation or retreat. He was a man who operated within the logic of influence and leverage, and what he was discovering was that neither of those things worked particularly well on a man who didn't have much to lose and wasn't especially worried about offending the right people. "I see," Foss said finally. He gathered his reins. "We'll relay your message." "You do that." They turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come. Cole watched them until they were over the ridge and out of sight. Then he picked up the axe and split the remaining wood, and when he was done, he went inside. Eliza was standing at the window. She had William held close in a way that looked automatic, protective, the gesture of a body that had made a decision without consulting the mind. She turned when Cole came in. Her face was doing the sealed thing again, but her eyes were present and alert and waiting. "I know who they were," she said. "I figured." "What did they say?" Cole hung his coat. "That the family wanted to speak with you, that there were interests involved. Regarding William." "Regarding William." She looked back at the window, though the men were long gone. "Gerald Foss. He's Thomas's older brother's lawyer. He does the family's tidying up." She said the last 2 words with a precise, controlled distaste. "Did he threaten you?" "He was too practiced to threaten directly," he implied. "He'll be back," she said. "He's not the kind of man who accepts one refusal." Cole sat down in the chair by the fire. "I know." Eliza turned from the window. She was looking at him with that quality again, the weighing and measuring, but there was something else in it now, something that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude. She'd moved past that, he thought, or through it. something closer to recognition. The recognition of someone who has spent a long time wondering whether the people in her life could be relied on and has just received new information. "You didn't let them in," she said. "No. You didn't even consider it." "No," he said again. She stood there for a moment with William against her chest and the firelight on her face. Then she sat down in her chair across from him, and the two of them sat together the way they'd been sitting for weeks now, on either side of the fire, with the winter pressing in from outside. "He's going to need boots," she said, after a long silence. "When he starts walking, good ones." Cole looked at the baby, who was awake and watching the firelight with the intense focus he brought to most things. "He's got a few months before he needs to worry about that." "I know, I'm just thinking ahead." Cole considered this. Thinking ahead was, in its own way, an answer to Gerald Foss and everything he represented. Thinking about boots and walking and months into the future was the quiet, daily assertion that there would be a future here, that it would continue, that the life being built in this cabin was not provisional. "Get the boots from the cobbler in Hatchet Creek," Cole said. "Not the mercantile. Harlan makes better ones." Eliza nodded seriously, as though this were useful information she was filing away. Maybe it was. "I'll remember that." Outside, the wind picked up and drove something, snow or sleet, hard to tell, against the window glass. The fire responded by strengthening, throwing more light across the room. William yawned hugely, his tiny face scrunching with the effort of it, and made a small complaining sound that settled almost immediately into the beginning of sleep. Cole watched the baby settle. He thought about Gerald Foss riding back toward wherever he'd come from, carrying a message back to the Hart family, delivering Cole's refusal in the measured language of men who traded in legal weight. He thought about what came next. There would be something. There was always something. But not tonight. Tonight the fire was good, and the wind was outside where it belonged, and across from him Eliza Hart was putting William down in his cradle with the careful hands of a woman who was starting, slowly, to believe that things might work out. And Cole thought that if he were a man who prayed, he might have been grateful for that. He wasn't that kind of man. He was the kind who kept the fire going, and the door barred and faced what came in the morning. That had always been enough. He thought it would be enough for this too. He thought it. He wasn't certain of it. But he kept the fire going all the same. Gerald Foss came back, as Eliza had said he would. He came back 12 days later, and this time he didn't bring Beaumont. He brought 4 men instead, and none of them were lawyers. Cole saw them from the barn before they reached the gate. He'd been up since before dawn dealing with a calf that had gotten itself tangled in the remnant of the old fence on the south side, and he was tired and cold and had a long scratch on his forearm from the wire. He was walking back toward the cabin when the sound reached him. Hoofbeats. More than 2, coming from the north road at a pace that didn't bother with subtlety. He stopped in the yard and watched them come. Foss was still in front, still wearing the good coat, still carrying himself with that particular quality of a man who believes that arrangements will be made in his favor. But he'd recalibrated since the last visit. The men behind him were not associates or clerks. They were the kind of men that money hired when it had stopped relying on polite conversation. Cole crossed his arms and waited. Foss pulled up at this gate and looked down at him with an expression that had shed its previous pleasantness, like a coat that had stopped being useful. "Mr. Mercer, I was hoping we might have a more productive conversation this time." "Gates closed," Cole said. "Let me say, yes, I can see that." Foss looked at the men behind him briefly, a look that communicated something, then back at Cole. "I've been authorized by the Hart family to make a formal request. They want the child. The woman can go wherever she pleases. They have no interest in detaining her, but the child carries Hart blood, and the family has a legal and moral claim." "No," Cole said. Foss stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. "You're not in a position to make that determination. Maybe not legally." Cole kept his voice even. It was an effort. "But I'm in the position of standing between you and that cabin, and right now that's the determination that matters." One of the men behind Foss, heavy-set, with a dark beard and the hands of someone who worked with them, moved his horse a step forward. "We could just open the gate ourselves." Cole looked at him steadily. "You could try." The bearded man started to swing down from his horse, and Cole moved, not toward the man, but 3 steps to the right, where the fence post met the gate latch, positioning himself in a way that made clear without words what the next few seconds would cost anyone who pushed through. He still had the wire scratch on his arm and mud on his boots, and he hadn't slept enough, and none of that mattered because what mattered was the line and he was standing on it. The bearded man stopped, half off his horse, reading the situation. Enough! Foss's voice came out sharper than he'd probably intended. He was a man accustomed to having other men do this part of things, and the reality of it, the actual physical fact of confrontation, seemed to make him uncomfortable in a way he didn't entirely know what to do with. He looked at Cole. You understand what you're doing here. You're obstructing a legitimate family claim. The Harts have influence in 3 counties. They have lawyers in the capital. Whatever you think you're protecting, they will dismantle it legally, and it will take longer and hurt more than simply doing this the easy way now. Then they can dismantle it legally, Cole said, from a distance. As long as Eliza Hart is on this property, she and her son are under my protection. That's not negotiable, and it doesn't change based on how many men you bring. Foss stared at him. Behind Foss, the 4 men sat their horses and waited, looking at each other, looking at Cole, looking at Foss for direction. The direction wasn't coming because Foss had run into something he hadn't prepared for. A man who genuinely didn't care about the same things he'd been taught everyone cared about. He had not prepared for someone who couldn't be moved. The cabin door opened. Cole didn't turn around. He heard it, the particular sound of his own door, which he'd have known in his sleep, and kept his eyes on Foss and the men behind him. Eliza came to stand beside him. She had William on her left arm, pressed against her side. She'd come out without a coat, and the February cold hit her immediately, but she didn't show it, just stood there with her chin level and her eyes on Foss with an expression that Cole could only describe as a woman who had already been through the worst thing and had come out the other side. Gerald, she said. Foss looked at her with something that crossed briefly into discomfort before his professional composure shut it back down. Eliza, you're looking well. I'm looking alive, she said, which is more than you intended. Foss's expression did something complicated. The family. I know what the family wants. Her voice was steady and completely cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. They want William because Thomas's will allocates 1/3 of the estate to any legitimate child of his body. They don't believe he's legitimate because it's more convenient not to. I know every step of this argument, Gerald, because I was there for 3 months while the family worked out which version of events was most profitable. She shifted William against her side. I'm not signing anything. I'm not going anywhere. And if you take 1 step through that gate, I will make sure every court in this territory hears exactly what your instructions were when you had me removed from Heartland. Foss had gone very still. Cole glanced sideways at Eliza. In all the weeks she'd been here, he'd seen her tired, frightened, careful, funny, in small, unexpected ways, fierce in quiet ways. He had not seen this. This was something with steel all the way through it, no soft edges, something that had been forged in the specific heat of 4 years of marriage to a man who hadn't seen her and 3 months of being erased by his family. The woman you had on your payroll, Eliza continued, and her voice had taken on a slight precise quality, like someone reading from a document they have memorized. Not the man who tied me to the post, he was just following instructions, but the woman, Mrs. Crowley. She wrote things down. I didn't know that until after, but she came to me before Thomas died and she told me she'd been keeping records. She said she'd never planned to use them, but if anyone came to take the child, she would. Eliza let that sit for a moment. I have no idea if she actually did that. She may have been frightened into silence by now, but you don't know that either. The silence that followed had a particular quality. The silence of a bluff that might not be a bluff, which is the most effective kind. Foss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cole. Then he gathered his reins. This isn't finished, he said. I know, Eliza said. It never is with your family. But today, it's finished. Foss turned his horse. The 4 men turned with him, and they rode back up the north road and didn't look back. And Cole stood at the gate watching until they were gone, and then stood there another full minute after, because he wanted to be sure. When he turned around, Eliza was shaking. Not obviously. If you hadn't been watching her closely for weeks and learning the small tells of how she held herself, you wouldn't have seen it. But her hands were not steady, and some of the color had left her face, and she was breathing carefully, the way you breathe when you're managing something. Go inside, Cole said. You're not wearing a coat. I'm aware of that. Eliza. She looked at him, and whatever she saw in his expression, something he wasn't sure what, made her relax a fraction. She turned and went back inside, and he followed her in and shut the door. She sat down hard in the nearest chair, still holding William, who had been remarkably quiet through the whole thing and was now regarding his mother with an expression of solemn attention that was eerie in a 3-month-old. Cole went to the stove and put the coffee on without being asked. His hands were steady, which was mostly habit. "Was any of that true?" he asked. "About the woman, the records." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Crowley did tell me she kept records. I don't know if she still has them. I don't know if she'd come forward." She looked down at William. "I don't know if it would matter." "But you said it." "I said it because it was the only thing I had that Foss couldn't immediately refute." She looked up at him. "Was that wrong?" Cole thought about this genuinely. "No," he said. "No, I think that was the right call." She let out a long breath and some of the rigidity went out of her shoulders. "My heart is going very fast right now." "That's probably reasonable." "I didn't plan to come outside. I was watching from the window, and then I was just outside." She frowned slightly as though examining a choice she'd made without consulting herself. "I didn't want you to be out there alone." Cole poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table in front of her. He sat down in his own chair and held the cup in both hands, and thought about the fact that she had walked out of a warm cabin into February cold without a coat because she didn't want him to face 4 armed men alone, and she'd done it without thinking it through because she'd moved on instinct. He didn't say anything about it. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't make it awkward, and neither of them needed that. "They'll try a different approach next time," Eliza said. "Legal, probably. Foss isn't a physical man. He borrowed those 4 from someone, and it didn't go the way he needed it to." Cole drank his coffee. "We should talk to someone. A lawyer, if there's one in Hatchet Creek who isn't already in the Hart family's pocket." Eliza nodded slowly. "There's the question of cost. I've got some put by." She looked at him with that expression again, the one she used when he said something that surprised her by being straightforward, as though she kept expecting the catch and kept not finding it. "Cole," she said, "you've already given us shelter, food." "I know what I've given," he said. Not harshly, just clearly. "I'm not keeping a ledger. If you want to keep a ledger, that's something you can figure out later when things are more settled. Right now, we need to think about what's practical." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "A lawyer." William chose this moment to communicate his own opinion of the situation at some volume. Eliza shifted him automatically, settled him, and the crying dropped back to a low complaint and then stopped. She did this without interrupting the conversation, without even pausing her thought, the seamless multitasking of a woman who had been doing it for 3 months. "He was good out there," Cole said. "Quiet the whole time. He seems to understand when something serious is happening." Eliza looked down at him. Either that or he was too cold to bother crying. "How cold was it when you came outside?" "I don't know. Very." She met Cole's eyes. "I'd do it again." "I know," he said. The lawyer's name was Everett Cass, and he operated out of a small office above the saddle shop on Hatchet Creek's main street that smelled of leather and old paper and the particular mustiness of a place that had accumulated too many documents and not enough windows. He was 60 or thereabouts, with white hair that grew in directions that suggested he'd never made peace with it, and he had the direct, slightly impatient manner of a man who had seen most varieties of human trouble and classified them all. Cole explained the situation while Eliza sat across the desk and held William and watched Cass's face for his reactions. Cass listened without interrupting. When Cole was done, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The Hart family," he said, in the tone of a man confirming something he'd been expecting. "You know them?" Eliza said. "By reputation. They've got Jacob Marsh in Collier County doing their legal work, and Marsh is competent. Not brilliant, but thorough." Cass brought his gaze back down from the ceiling. "You said there may be a woman who kept records, a household member." "Maybe," Eliza said. "I genuinely don't know. If she exists and they're real, that's significant. If not, we're working with what we can prove about the legitimacy of the child, which is the timing of the pregnancy aligns with the marriage." "Clearly. Thomas and I," Eliza paused, and something crossed her face that was private and then passed. "The dates are not ambiguous. Any honest doctor who examined the records would say the same." "Good." Cass made a note. "The family's claim that the child is illegitimate is a legal assertion they'd have to prove, not you. Illegitimacy has to be established. The presumption under the law is legitimacy for a child born in marriage." He looked at them both. "What I'm telling you is that their position is not as strong legally as they're behaving like it is. What they're banking on is that you don't have resources to fight them, and they do. Which is true, Eliza said. It's less true than it was, Cole said. Cass looked between them. He seemed to be assessing what he was looking at. Not just the legal situation, but the two of them, the relationship, whatever it was. His expression was professionally neutral. I'll take the case, he said. My fee is what I think the case is worth, which, in this instance, I'll call reasonable. I've never liked the Hart family's methods, and this is an opportunity to say so with paperwork. He stood up and extended his hand to Eliza first. Mrs. Hart, I'd advise keeping documentation of every contact from the family going forward. Dates, names, what was said. I can do that, Eliza said. Mr. Mercer. He shook Cole's hand. I'd also advise, as a practical matter, that the two of you consider... He stopped. Well, that's not my business. He sat back down and began organizing the papers on his desk. Consider what? Cole said. Cass looked at him with the slight weariness of a man who has been a lawyer for 30 years and has seen how courts think. A woman living with a man she's not married to, in a custody dispute involving the question of respectability and legitimacy, it doesn't help is all. The law is one thing, judges are another. The office was quiet for a moment, just the sound of traffic from the street below and the creak of the building. Cole looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at Cole. Neither of them said anything, but there was a conversation happening in the silence of it, fast and complicated, conducted entirely through the slight shift of expression between two people who had spent 3 months learning to read each other. Thank you, Cole said to Cass. We'll think on that. They left the office and went back out into the cold, and Cole helped Eliza up onto Soot, and they rode out of Hatchet Creek toward home. They didn't discuss what Cass had said on the road. They didn't discuss it when they got back. They went about the rest of the day's work, Cole finishing the fence repair he'd started before Foss arrived, Eliza baking the bread that had been rising since morning, and the evening arrived and then the night. It was only after William was down and the fire settled that Eliza said quietly, without looking up from the book she was holding but clearly not reading. He wasn't wrong. No, Cole said. He wasn't. Another silence. A long one. I want to be clear, Eliza said. She set the book down and looked at him directly. I'm not saying any of this because I think I owe it to you or because I don't have other options. I'm saying it because you should know what I'm actually thinking, and I've gotten tired of not saying the things I'm thinking. Cole put down his own work. He gave her his full attention. When you found me on that ridge, she said, I had already decided that the only outcome was that William would survive, and I probably wouldn't. I was just holding on until I was sure he had enough body heat stored up to have a chance. She said this without dramatics, just the plain fact of it. I'd made my peace with that. She paused. And then you came down off the trail and cut the rope, and the whole calculation changed. Cole was very still. I don't know what that is, she said. I don't know what to call it, what you did, or what we've been doing since. I know it's been 3 months, and you have fed me and kept me safe and argued with lawyers on my behalf and held my son when I was too sick to hold him myself. She looked down briefly and then back up. I know that I'm not the same person who was tied to that post. And I know that a significant part of that is because of who was in this cabin when I woke up. Cole was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way of a man who does not say things before he's sure of them. I don't want you to make a decision based on what a lawyer said about how judges think, he said. I'm not. She held his gaze. I'm telling you what I feel. Eliza. I know, she said. I know it's complicated. I know we've been here 3 months and neither of us is exactly... I know that. I'm not asking you for anything. She stopped, started again. I wanted you to know before anything else happens, before whatever Foss tries next. I wanted you to know. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did, pressing at the walls, testing the joins, and the cabin was holding the way it always held. Cole looked at this woman who had been tied to a fence post and come out the other side and walked into February cold, without a coat, to stand beside him, and who had just said the most direct thing anyone had said to him in years. I know, he said. It wasn't everything. It also wasn't nothing. Between the two of them, in this particular cabin, with this particular fire and this particular baby sleeping 20 feet away, it was enough to sit in for a while. Eliza picked up her book. Cole picked up his work. The evening continued. Neither of them said anything else, but the silence between them had changed again, slightly, the way it kept changing, finding new shapes, new textures, as the weeks added up and something was being slowly, carefully built between them that neither of them had names for yet, but that both of them recognized, the way you recognize a thing you've heard described but never thought you'd see. It was building, whatever it was. And Gerald Foss, somewhere north on the road back to Collier County, was not finished. And the town of Hatchet Creek had not stopped watching. And spring was still weeks away, and the winter that remained had teeth. None of that had resolved. All of it was still coming. But tonight, at least, this was what the cabin held. Two people sitting by a fire that was holding against the cold, and a baby sleeping between them, and something growing in the space between saying nothing and saying everything. It was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the most important thing in the room. Everett Cass sent his first letter to Jacob Marsh in Collier County on a Thursday in late February, and by the second week of March he had a response that he summarized for Cole and Eliza in his office above the saddle shop with the particular flatness of a man delivering news he'd been expecting. "They're filing a petition," Cass said. "Formal challenge to William's legitimacy. They've got a doctor, but not the one from before, a different one, who's prepared to testify about the timeline of the pregnancy." He set the letter on the desk and looked at them both. "The timeline argument is weak, I want to be clear about that. But it gives them a legal foothold, and that's all they need to start the process." "What does the process look like?" Cole asked. "It means a hearing, probably in Collier County, which is their preferred ground and their preferred judge." Cass laced his fingers together on the desk. "I'm going to contest the venue. We want the hearing here or somewhere neutral." "Can you get that?" "Possibly. It'll take time." He looked at Eliza. "In the meantime, they're also filing a separate motion questioning your fitness as a sole guardian. It's a secondary argument, a pressure tactic, the kind of thing you file to create noise and cost and anxiety rather than because you expect it to succeed." Eliza absorbed this without visible reaction. "What grounds?" "They'll argue that your current living situation is irregular." Cass said it with clinical care. "A woman of questionable reputation residing with an unmarried man, they'll try to make the judge imagine a household that isn't appropriate for a child." The three of them sat with that for a moment. "We discussed this," Cole said. He looked at Eliza. She looked back at him. They had discussed it in the careful, circling way of two people who are trying to approach a thing honestly without either of them feeling pressured by circumstance. They'd had two conversations about it, one the night after the first visit to Cass, one a week later, both of them sitting at the table with coffee and William sleeping nearby, both of them trying to locate what was true as opposed to what was practical. "We did," Eliza said to Cass. Cass waited. "We'd like to know what a marriage license requires in this county," Cole said. Cass looked at him for a moment, and something in the older man's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "Standard requirements. 2 adults, a witness, a signed declaration. I can perform it myself as a notary, if you'd prefer to keep it simple." He paused. "I want to be clear that a marriage, while it helps certain aspects of the case, doesn't automatically resolve the legitimacy question. The Harts will still pursue that argument regardless." "I understand," Cole said. "I also want to be clear that what I said in this office before was legal advice, not personal advice. The decision is ours," Eliza said. "We know." Cass nodded once. He picked up the letter from Marsh and set it aside and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. "All right, let me tell you what I need from both of you to respond to this petition." They spent an hour in that office, going through the legal particulars, the documentation that needed to be gathered, records of Thomas and Eliza's marriage, records of William's birth as best as they could be established, a written account of what had happened on Heartland in the weeks before Cole found her on the ridge. Eliza gave that account with the same controlled precision she brought to anything difficult, and Cass wrote it down without comment, though once, when she described being bound to the post, his pen stopped moving for a moment before he continued. On the ride home they were quiet for a while. The March sky had that particular pale quality of a season in transition, not quite ready to commit to spring, still carrying the gray weight of the months behind it. The road was soft in places, mud showing through where the frost was retreating. "I want to ask you something," Eliza said. "Go ahead." "Last night, you told Cass we'd discussed it." She was looking at the road ahead. "And we did. But I want to ask you directly, without the lawyer in the room and without the legal situation framing it." She paused. "Is this something you want? Not something you're doing because it helps the case?" Cole took a moment. He did that. Took moments. and she had learned that it wasn't hesitation in the sense of uncertainty, but the way he processed things, from the inside out rather than the outside in. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "You asked me to be direct," he said. "That's the direct answer." "You've known me 4 months. I've known you 4 months in a way that most people don't know each other in 4 years," he said. "I've seen you sick and scared and standing at my gate in February without a coat telling a lawyer's hired hands exactly where they could direct their concerns. I've seen you with William at 3 in the morning, and I've seen what you're like when you think no one's paying attention." He looked at her briefly and then back at the road. "I don't need more time to know what kind of person you are." Eliza was quiet. "What about you?" he said. She thought about it. She gave it the same honest treatment he had. "I told you 2 weeks ago what I felt," she said. "That hasn't changed. What's changed is that now there's a legal reason on top of it, and I want to make sure you know that the legal reason is secondary," he said. "Yes." "I know," he said. "I know it is." She nodded and looked at the road. And they rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was the kind of silence that had something settled in it now, something decided, and it sat between them with a different weight from all the other silences that had come before. Yes. They were married on a Saturday in mid-March in Everett Cass's office with his clerk, a young woman named Abigail who seemed genuinely moved by the occasion in a way that made Eliza feel unexpectedly tender toward her, and old Ben Harder from the adjacent property, who Cole had asked because he was trustworthy and close by and unlikely to make a production of it. Cole had asked if she wanted anything particular, a dress, flowers, some kind of gathering. Eliza had said no. What she wanted was for it to be real, and real didn't require decoration. It was short. Cass read what needed to be read. They said what needed to be said. The papers were signed. Ben Harder congratulated them with genuine warmth and the slightly awkward vigor of a man who was not accustomed to being at weddings and wasn't sure what to do with his hands. Abigail sniffled very quietly and then looked embarrassed about it. William slept through the whole thing strapped to Eliza's chest, which was, she thought, probably the right call on his part. What she hadn't anticipated was the moment after, the moment when the papers were signed and Cass was shaking both their hands and Ben Harder was putting on his coat. And Cole looked at her, and she looked at him in the ordinary light of that ordinary office above the saddle shop. And what she felt was not the complicated, qualified thing she'd been expecting, but something much simpler. She felt safe, not in the provisional sense, not in the sense of being protected from external things, in the deeper sense of being in a place that was hers, of being with a person who had chosen her, not as a solution to a problem, but as a person, and had chosen her steadily and without drama over 4 months of circumstances that would have driven most people toward easier choices. She didn't cry. She wasn't a person who cried easily, but she held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and he held hers back, and something passed between them that was too specific to be named but was nonetheless entirely clear. They rode home. Ben Harder went his own way. Cass's office went back to being an office. The land outside Hatchet Creek didn't look any different. The mud was still mud, and the sky was still the same committed gray. But when they came through the gate of Cole's property, her property, she supposed now, legally speaking, though she'd have to work out how to think about that, and she climbed down from soot and stood in the yard she'd been learning for 4 months, it felt different. Not bigger, exactly. More solid. "I'll get supper started," she said. "I'll do the horses," Cole said. They separated to their tasks the same way they did every evening, with the easy division of a household that had developed its own logic. Nothing looked different. The cabin was the same cabin. The fire needed to be built up the same way it always did. But she was making supper in her own house, and William was going to grow up knowing who his father was, and whatever Gerald Foss filed next, the question of Eliza's fitness and reputation had a different shape to it now. She made the best meal she could manage from what they had in the stores. She'd been supplementing them more creatively as the winter went on, had developed opinions about what dried herbs did, what and how far you could stretch a decent piece of venison. And Cole came in from the barn and washed up and sat down, and they ate together the way they always ate, without ceremony, but with a quality to the evening that was different, not dramatically different. Life, Eliza had learned, did not rearrange itself visibly for the things that mattered most. The cabin was the same temperature. William woke up hungry at the same hour he always did. The wind did what the March wind did. But something was different. She felt it, and she knew he did too, and neither of them needed to say so. The letter arrived 2 weeks after the wedding. It came from a town called Mineral Falls, which was 4 counties to the east and a name Eliza hadn't heard before. It was addressed to her, in handwriting she didn't recognize, and the return address was a law office. She opened it at the table while Cole was outside. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the wall. Cole came in about 20 minutes later. He saw her face. "What is it?" She handed him the letter. He read it standing up, still in his coat. His expression while he read was the one it always was. Neutral, attentive, giving nothing away until he'd finished and had something definite to say. He reached the end and lowered the letter and looked at her. "Your mother's cousin," he said. "Ida Marsh, I barely know her. I met her twice as a child." Eliza looked at the letter on the table between them. "She says she's been looking for me since she heard what happened. She has a house in Mineral Falls and an income from her late husband's business holdings and no children." She swallowed. "She's offering me a place, a proper place, money, stability, a fresh start in a town that doesn't know the Hart name." Cole set the letter back on the table. He took off his coat and hung it and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything yet. "She says there's room for William," Eliza said. "She says she'd help raise him, that he could have—" She uses the word advantages, education, connections. She stopped. "She's not wrong that she could offer those things. She clearly has resources." The fire was going and the afternoon light was coming through the west window at that particular angle it had in mid-March, the angle that said winter was losing its grip, that the season was shifting. It lit the side of Cole's face and the grain of the wooden table and the letter lying between them. "What do you want to do?" Cole said. Eliza looked at him. "You're not going to tell me what you think?" "Not yet. I want to hear what you want first." She let out a breath. "I don't know. That's the honest answer. 2 weeks ago the answer would have been simple. But 2 weeks ago She gestured slightly, a small movement that encompassed the marriage and everything around it. "And now there's this." "The timing's interesting," Cole said. "Yes, it is." She'd thought about that too. Foss had resources and reach, and she didn't think it was outside the realm of possibility that this letter had been facilitated somehow, that someone had pointed Ida Marsh in her direction, told her the situation, maybe even suggested the offer. She couldn't prove that. But the timing was very specific. "She might be genuine," Cole said. "She might have heard what happened and genuinely want to help. She might. Or it might be another angle." "Yes." Eliza looked at the letter again. "Even if it's genuine, even if Ida Marsh is exactly what she says she is and there's no connection to the Harts, it doesn't change what she's offering. It's real, whatever the reason behind it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "What would you be leaving?" he said. "Not you'd be leaving me or you'd be leaving this." Just the open question. Eliza thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about everything since she'd learned the cost of not being honest with herself. She would be leaving a cabin on 40 acres outside a town that had spent 5 months having opinions about her. She'd be leaving mud and frost and the specific physical weight of frontier life, the way your body registered every hour of it by the end of the day. She'd be leaving the ongoing legal fight with the Hart family, which was expensive and uncertain and not guaranteed to resolve in her favor. She would also be leaving the kitchen where she'd figured out how to make dried beans taste like something, the chickens she'd named against her better judgment, the way the afternoon light came through the west window, the sound of Cole's boots on the porch steps when he came in from the barn, which she'd learned to track without meaning to, the evenings by the fire, the way William's face changed when Cole came through the door, even at 4 months old, that specific alert recognition, the small reaching motion of his arms. She would be leaving a man who had cut her free from a fence post and walked her 2 miles through snow without asking for a single thing in return, and who had stood between her and 4 armed men without picking up a weapon, and who had said yes when she asked him directly whether he wanted this, and had said it the way he said everything, without performance, from the center of himself outward. "I need to tell you something," she said. Cole waited. "I wrote back to Mrs. Crowley 2 months ago, the woman from the Hart household who I said might have records. I didn't know if she'd respond. I didn't know if the letter would even reach her, but I wrote to her." Eliza looked at her hands. "She wrote back last week. I didn't tell you because I was still working out what it meant." Cole's expression shifted slightly. "She has records. She has records. A journal," she says. "She kept it for 3 years. Dates, conversations, instructions from the family. including instructions about me. Eliza finally looked up from her hands. Including the specific order regarding the fence post, who gave it, and the exact words used. She was present when it was given. The room was very quiet. Eliza, Cole said. I know. I should have told you sooner. You're telling me now. He leaned forward. Where is she? A town called Perry, 2 counties south. She left Hard Employ in January. She said she couldn't stay after what happened. Eliza's voice had gone carefully flat. She's willing to testify. She's afraid to, but she's willing. Cole sat with this for a moment, and she could see him reorganizing the situation in his mind. The legal case, Foss's petition, the leverage it created, and the danger that came with it. We need to tell Cass, he said. I know. This changes things. If she'll testify, the legitimacy argument becomes much harder for them. They're not just fighting the medical records. They're fighting a witness who was in the room. I know. Eliza took a breath. Cole, this is the thing I keep coming back to. If Mrs. Crowley testifies, the Hart family will know I have a witness. Foss will know. And they will do everything they can to discredit her, threaten her, remove her as a factor. Probably. She's a woman alone with no resources. She's vulnerable in ways we aren't. Cole was quiet for a moment. He was putting the pieces together. She could see it. You want to go to her? I want to go to her and help her prepare. Make sure she has what she needs. Make sure Cass can meet with her directly and establish the legal protection that might give her enough cover to go through with it. Eliza looked at him steadily. I know the timing is terrible. I know Foss's petition is moving, and going away for even a week is... I'll go with you, Cole had said. She stopped. You don't have to. 2 days to Perry and back. The cattle can manage 2 days. Harder can check on them. He said this in the flat, practical tone he used when something was settled. We're not sending you to another county alone to meet with a witness who the Hart family would prefer didn't exist. Cole? No, he said. Not harsh, just clear. We'll take William. We'll go to Perry. We'll meet Mrs. Crowley. We'll get her in front of Cass as fast as we can manage, and then we come home and we deal with the rest of it. He looked at her. That's how this goes. Eliza looked at him across the table. She thought about the letter from Ida Marsh, still lying there with its offer of comfort and distance and a clean start. She thought about the weight of what Cole had just said. We come home. Said without any awareness of its own significance, the same way he did everything. All right, she said. They left 2 days later, on a Tuesday, when the weather was decent enough to make the journey reasonable. Cole had arranged things with Ben Harder, packed what they needed with the efficient minimalism of a man who traveled light, and helped Eliza get William organized for 2 days of movement, which required considerably more logistics than either of them had initially calculated. The road to Perry was better than the road out of Hatchet Creek, which was faint praise, but the March weather held and they made decent time. William, who had recently developed opinions about long journeys expressed at considerable volume, was more cooperative than expected, spending most of the first day sleeping against Eliza's chest with the focused determination of a child who had decided this was his best option. They stayed one night at a way station, a modest establishment that offered beds and a meal without asking too many questions, which Cole seemed to have a gift for finding, and reached Perry by the middle of the second morning. Mrs. Crowley was not what Eliza had expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. A woman in her 50s, small and neat, and carrying herself with the particular dignity of a person who had spent decades in domestic service and had learned that dignity was the one thing that couldn't be taken from you. She met them at the door of the small rented room she was living in, and she looked at Eliza for a long moment before she stepped back to let them in. Mrs. Hart, she said. Mrs. Mercer now, Eliza said. Something in Mrs. Crowley's face shifted. Good, she said simply. That's good. She made tea with a precision that suggested she'd been making tea for other people for so long it had become automatic, and she sat across from them and told them everything she'd written in the journal, which was more than Eliza had known, more specific, more damaging to the Hart family. The instructions regarding the post had come from Daniel Hart, Thomas's eldest brother, the one who stood to inherit the largest portion, and Mrs. Crowley had written them down that same evening because she'd had a feeling, she said, the kind you can't explain but that you recognize as important. I was afraid, Mrs. Crowley said. I want to be honest about that. I'm still afraid. But I watched from the kitchen window when they brought you out that morning. She looked at Eliza directly. You were carrying the baby under your coat. You weren't even letting them see him. And I thought, if I don't say something, if I keep quiet because I'm frightened, then fear wins. and I'm too old to let fear have the last word." The room was quiet. "The lawyer's name is Everett Cass," Cole said. "He's in Hatchet Creek. We're going to write to him today and tell him you've agreed to speak with him. He'll want to do that soon in person. Can you make that journey?" "I can," Mrs. Crowley said. She looked at William, who was awake now, and examining her with his intense, evaluating gaze. Something in her expression softened. "He looks like his father," she said. "Whatever anyone said otherwise, he looks like Thomas Hart. Anyone who knew Thomas would say the same." "Would you say that?" Eliza asked. "Under oath?" "Yes," Mrs. Crowley said. "I'd say everything under oath." They stayed 3 hours and left with what they needed. Her agreement, her contact information, a clearer picture of what the journal contained and how it would hold up if challenged. Cole said very little during most of it, the way he was in situations that required attention rather than input. But on the way out, he stopped at the door and turned back. "Mrs. Crowley," he said, "the Hart family is going to find out you're involved. They may approach you. They may try to intimidate you or offer you money to recant." Mrs. Crowley looked at him with the steadiness of someone who had already had this conversation with herself. "I know. If that happens, you write to Everett Cass immediately. His address is on the card I left you. Don't try to handle it yourself and don't agree to anything." "I understand." Cole nodded. He looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite gratitude but was in that territory. "What you did matters," he said. "What you kept, and that you're willing to come forward, that matters." Mrs. Crowley looked at William again. "Make sure he has a good life," she said. "That's all." They rode back to Hatchet Creek and arrived home on Thursday evening, tired and road-worn, and carrying more than they'd left with. The cabin was cold but standing. The cattle were fine. Harder had done what he'd said he would. Eliza stood in the yard for a moment after Cole took Soot to the barn, just stood in the cooling March air and looked at the cabin. The light from the window where the fire was coming back up, the smell of the wood smoke, the familiar shape of the roof against the darkening sky. The letter from Ida Marsh was still on the table inside. She'd known, on the road home, what she was going to do with it. She'd known, if she was honest, since the moment Cole had said, "We come home," and she'd felt the two words settle into her like something clicking into place. She went inside and got William settled and put the coffee on, and when Cole came in from the barn, she was sitting at the table with the letter in front of her. "I'm going to write back to Ida Marsh," she said. He sat down. "I'm going to thank her. I'm going to tell her that her offer was generous and that I'm grateful she looked for me." She looked at the letter one more time and then folded it. "And I'm going to tell her that I'm where I'm supposed to be." Cole looked at her across the table. The fire had caught properly now, and the cabin was warming, and William was making small settled sounds from his cradle, and outside the March dark was coming down over the valley. "You're sure?" Cole said. "I've been sure for a while," Eliza said. "I just needed to say it out loud." He nodded. He reached across the table and picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, with an openness in his expression that he usually kept turned inward, something unguarded and clear. She was always paying attention. She always had been. "Cass needs to know about Mrs. Crowley first thing tomorrow," she said. "I'll write in. And we should talk about what happens if the hearing is in Collier County anyway. Cass said he'd contest the venue, but we'll deal with that when we know," Cole said. "One thing at a time." Eliza looked at him. She thought about the fence post and the rope and the gray February dawn when she had been 1 hour from the end of everything, and she thought about the sound of a horse coming down off the ridge, and a man crouching in front of her in the snow, and the word "hey," not the most useful thing he'd ever offered a person, and how it had been, in that moment, the most important word she'd ever heard in her life. One thing at a time. "All right," she said. "One thing at a time." Everett Cass met with Mrs. Crowley on a Wednesday in early April in his office above the saddle shop with the door closed, and Abigail posted downstairs with instructions to say he wasn't in if anyone from out of county came asking. Cole and Eliza waited in the office while it happened. There wasn't much room. Cass's office had never been designed for waiting. So Cole stood by the window, and Eliza sat in the one extra chair with William on her knee, and they listened to Cass ask questions in his careful, methodical way, and Mrs. Crowley answered them with the same precise calm she'd shown in Perry. The journal was on the desk between them. Cass had read it twice before the meeting and had said, privately, to Cole that morning, that it was more than he'd hoped for. What it contained, laid out in Mrs. Crowley's small, neat handwriting across 3 years of entries, was a record of a family that had decided what it wanted and systematically removed every obstacle between itself and that outcome. There were entries about Thomas Hart's health in the final year, the family's awareness of his decline, the conversations about the estate, the calculations being made while a man was still breathing. There were entries about Eliza, about the family's response when her pregnancy became apparent, the meetings Cole hadn't been party to, the specific language Daniel Hart had used when he decided that the most efficient solution was removal. And there was the entry from the morning of, 3 lines in Mrs. Crowley's hand, the date, the instruction, and the name of the man who gave it. Daniel Hart, not Foss, not a lawyer or an intermediary. Daniel Hart himself, in his own dining room over breakfast. When the meeting was done and Mrs. Crowley had gone back to her room at the boarding house where Cass had arranged for her to stay, Cass sat down behind his desk and looked at the journal for a moment. "This is a significant document," he said. "Can you use it?" Cole asked. "The question is whether the court will accept it as evidence. A personal journal isn't testimony. It's one person's account. But Mrs. Crowley is willing to testify to everything in it, and the journal corroborates her testimony and establishes that it wasn't constructed after the fact." Cass looked at Eliza. "The Harts are going to attack her credibility. They'll say she's disgruntled, that she was dismissed, that she has a motive to harm the family. She left voluntarily," Eliza said, "after what she saw. I know, and we'll establish that. But you need to be prepared for them to make it ugly." He paused. "I'm filing a counter motion today. I'm going to request that the venue be moved here, and I'm going to include a summary of Mrs. Crowley's willingness to testify. That summary is going to reach Jacob Marsh within the week, and Marsh is going to take it to Daniel Hart." He looked at both of them. "What happens next depends on how Daniel Hart responds to the information that someone who was in the room is prepared to go on record." "He'll try to stop her," Eliza said. "He'll try," Cass said. "Or he'll do something I think is more likely." Cole looked at him. "Which is?" "He'll look at the cost of a public hearing where that journal gets read into the record, where a credible witness testifies about specific instructions given at a specific breakfast table, where his family's internal calculations about his brother's estate become part of the public legal record." Cass set his pen down. "And he'll decide that settling quietly is cheaper than winning loudly." The office was quiet. Outside, Hatchet Creek went about its business, the sounds of it rising through the floorboards, a wagon, voices, the distant rhythm of the blacksmith 2 streets over. "You think they'll settle," Cole said. "I think Daniel Hart is a man who has spent his life managing how things look," Cass said. "A public hearing doesn't serve that. Whatever he gets out of winning the legitimacy argument, he loses it 3 times over if the method of how he treated his brother's widow becomes public knowledge across 3 counties. He leaned forward. "This isn't about justice, Mr. Mercer. I want to be honest with you about that. This is about leverage. We now have some." Cole looked at Eliza. She was looking at the journal on the desk with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something that had anger in it and grief in it, and a particular exhausted recognition, like seeing the shape of a thing you'd known was there but hadn't been able to prove. "What do we ask for?" she said. "In a settlement." "That's what I need to know from you," Cass said. She thought about it. "I don't want money from them," she said. "I don't want anything from that estate. I want them to withdraw the legitimacy petition and file a formal acknowledgement that William Thomas Hart is the legitimate son of Thomas Hart, deceased. I want it filed with the court and recorded." She paused. "And I want them to leave us alone. No more Foss, no more visits, no more letters. A legal agreement that they will make no further claim on me or my son." Cass wrote this down. "And in exchange..." "Mrs. Crowley's journal doesn't become public record," Eliza said. "She cooperated in good faith, and I don't want to put her through a hearing if we can avoid it. And the details of what the family did, the post, all of it, I won't pursue civil damages." She looked at Cass steadily. "I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for it to be over." Cass looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, Cole thought, as close to admiring as a man like Cass probably got. "That's a reasonable position," he said, "and strategically, it's wise. They're more likely to take a settlement that doesn't require them to publicly admit wrongdoing." "They know what they did," Eliza said. "I don't need a court to tell them." The response from Jacob Marsh came in 12 days. It came not as a legal filing, but as a private letter to Cass, which meant Marsh had taken it to Daniel Hart, and Daniel Hart had made a calculation. The letter was careful and worded to admit nothing, the language of lawyers who are solving a problem without creating a new one, but the substance of it was clear enough. The Hart family was prepared to discuss the terms of a resolution. Cass read the letter aloud in his office with Cole and Eliza across the desk. When he finished, he set it down and looked at them. "This is the beginning of a negotiation," he said, "not an agreement. They'll try to water down the acknowledgement. They'll want language that's technically a confirmation of legitimacy without being a direct admission that their challenge was wrong. We're going to push back on that." "Push back as much as you need to," Cole said. "There's also the question of Mrs. Crowley. They know she's involved. Marcia's letter doesn't mention her directly, but the timing and content make clear that her potential testimony is part of what brought them to the table." Cass looked at Eliza. "Are you prepared for them to contact her directly?" "We've already talked about it," Eliza said. "She knows to go through you." "Good." Cass folded the letter. "I'll draft a response today. I'd estimate 3 to 4 weeks before we have something final if they're negotiating in good faith. And if they're not, then we find out in 3 to 4 weeks and we go to hearing." He said it with the equanimity of a man who had been in both situations before and had developed a professional relationship with uncertainty. "Either way, you're in a better position than you were 2 months ago." They left the office and walked out into an April morning that had finally committed to being spring. Actual warmth in the sunlight, the mud starting to firm up, the cottonwoods along the creek showing the first tentative green at their tips. William was in his sling against Eliza's chest, awake and interested in the street with the focused attention he brought to new environments. 3 to 4 weeks, Cole said. "I can wait 3 to 4 weeks, Eliza said. She'd waited longer for less. He looked at her sideways. "You doing all right?" "Yes." She thought about it. "Better than all right. Strange as that sounds." "Doesn't sound strange." "It should. There's a lawsuit pending, and we just spent an hour discussing what kind of legal language constitutes a real acknowledgement versus a fake one." She looked at the street ahead of them, the ordinary activity of a small frontier town on a spring morning. "But I keep thinking about that letter from Ida Marsh, the one I turned down, and I keep thinking about what I would have had if I'd taken it." "Safety," Cole said. "Security. Yes, all of that." She adjusted William in the sling. "And none of this. None of the 3 weeks of watching Cass work and knowing it might not be enough, and lying awake running through every possible outcome." She paused. "I'd have had comfort, and I'd have lost the thing that I didn't know I needed until I had it." "Which is?" She thought about how to say it precisely. "Being in a fight that's mine," she said finally, "not hiding from it. Not being managed through it by someone else with resources and good intentions. Being in it myself with someone beside me who's in it too." She looked at him. "That's what I'd have lost." Cole didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You know Cass is doing most of the actual fighting." Eliza laughed. It came out genuine and a little surprised, the way her laughs often did, as though she kept being caught off guard by the fact that she still could. "He is," she said. "He's very good at it." "He is," Cole agreed. They walked back to where Soot was hitched, and Cole untied the horse and checked the saddle, and Eliza stood in the April sunlight with William in the sling and looked at her husband doing an ordinary thing in an ordinary moment, and she thought, "This is it. This right here. Not the outcome of the lawsuit or the legal acknowledgement or the settlement terms. This. The ordinary morning, the horse, the man who got up before dawn and kept the fire and stood at the gate and said no because the answer was no. Simple as that. This was the thing worth staying for. She'd known it for months. She was still knowing it, in the way that you keep knowing certain things, not once but continuously, every day, like a truth that needs to be reconfirmed by living. The negotiation took 5 weeks, not 3 or 4. There were 2 rounds of counterproposals and 1 letter from Marsh that was, in Cass's words, so deliberately obtuse that he'd had to set it aside for a day before responding to it. Daniel Hart's lawyers wanted language. They wanted the acknowledgement framed as a clarification rather than a reversal. They wanted clauses and conditions and limitations that Cass dismantled one by one with the patient. Relentless thoroughness of a man who had nothing to prove and all the time it took. Mrs. Crowley stayed in Hatchet Creek through all of it, in the boarding house room. Eliza visited her twice a week, bringing food from the cabin, bread, preserved fruit, a jar of the soup she'd developed over the winter that Mrs. Crowley said was the best thing she'd eaten in years, which Eliza suspected was partly politeness, but accepted anyway. They talked during those visits in the way of women who have been through something together and know it. Not always about what had happened, sometimes about ordinary things. What Mrs. Crowley had done before the Hart household, what she planned to do after, the small logistics of a life being rebuilt. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Eliza asked her one afternoon in early May, "when this is done?" "My sister's in Laramie," Mrs. Crowley said. "We've been writing. She has room." She looked at her hands. "I stayed with the Harts too long. I knew it for the last year, and I stayed anyway because I was used to it, and leaving felt like falling." She paused. "I understand that kind of staying, the comfortable kind that isn't actually comfortable." "Yes," Eliza said. "I understand that too." Mrs. Crowley looked at her with the directness she'd had from the start. "You're different from when you were at Hart House. You know that." Eliza considered this. "Different how?" "You used to watch the room before you walked into it, check who was where, what the mood was, whether it was safe to take up space." Mrs. Crowley's voice was matter-of-fact. "You don't do that anymore, or you do it less." Eliza thought about the cabin, about how she'd moved through it carefully at first, the borrowed space feeling, the constant low-level calculation of whether she was taking too much, about how that had faded, gradually, the way frost fades when the season shifts, not in a single moment but in accumulation degree by degree, until one day you notice it's simply gone. "No," she said, "I do it less." Mrs. Crowley nodded once. "Good," she said, in the same tone she'd used the day they arrived in Perry, and Eliza had said Mrs. Mercer now. The same word with the same weight to it, as though good was sufficient and anything more would be surplus. The agreement was signed on the 14th of May. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in weather and in every visible respect. Cass laid the documents out on his desk and walked through them one final time. The formal withdrawal of the legitimacy petition, the court-filed acknowledgement that William Thomas Hart was the legitimate son of Thomas Hart and therefore entitled to his inheritance rights under the estate, and a binding legal agreement that the Hart family would make no further claim or contact. The acknowledgement language was what Eliza had asked for. Cass had held the line on it through 3 rounds of negotiation, and in the end Marsh had conceded because the alternative was a hearing, and Daniel Hart had done his cost calculation and arrived at the conclusion that Cass had predicted. Eliza read every word before she signed. Cole stood behind her and read it too, because he was the kind of man who read things before decisions were made on the basis of them. Cass waited with the patience of a man who respected the process. When she signed, her hand was steady. When Cole signed as witness, his hand was steady too. Cass signed last, as notary and counsel of record. He blotted the ink and looked at the document for a moment with the expression of a man reviewing finished work. "It's done," he said. Eliza sat with that for a moment. "It's done." 2 words for the end of something that had started in a barn in Collier County, moved through a dining room where a man had said certain things over breakfast, and a woman had written them down, continued across a fence post in the snow on the Holloway Ridge, and arrived here. This office, this desk, this paper with her name on it, and William's name on it, and a line drawn under it. "Thank you," she said to Cass. He waved a hand in the way of a man who was uncomfortable with gratitude and preferred results. "I'll send Mrs. Crowley a copy. She should have one for her records." "She's leaving for Laramie this week," Eliza said. "I'll bring it to her." She brought it that afternoon, and Mrs. Crowley read it at her small table by the window with the same careful attention Eliza had used. And when she was done, she folded it precisely and held it in both hands for a moment. "I'm glad I wrote it down," she said. "I didn't know what it was for. When I started, I had a feeling." "I know," Eliza said. "I'm glad too." Mrs. Crowley looked at her one more time with those direct, assessing eyes. "You'll be all right," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eliza said. "We will." They embraced briefly, the careful embrace of 2 women who had not been close but had been through something together that made closeness beside the point. Then Eliza walked back out into the May afternoon, into the sunlight and the greening cottonwoods and the sounds of Hatchet Creek being an ordinary town on an ordinary day. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment and just stood there. Let the sun hit her face. Let the town be around her. Ruth Cantor coming out of the milliner's across the street, Margaret Aldis visible through the window of the dry goods store, 3 men she didn't know talking near the livery. All of them part of the world that had spent 6 months having opinions about her, and all of them, at this moment, simply people doing their afternoon business in a town she lived in. She was not afraid of any of them. She hadn't noticed when that had changed. It had changed the way most things changed. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of days, each one adding something small, until the weight was different without the balance point ever being clearly visible. She walked back to where Cole was waiting with the horses and told him it was done. He looked at her face, and he knew it was, before she said it. He had gotten very good at reading her face. "Home?" he said. "Home," she said. When May moved into June, and the land came back to life with the specific urgency of a northern valley that knows it has a limited season and intends to use every day of it. Cole planted the kitchen garden expanded from last year's footprint, Eliza's idea, argued for with the practical logic she brought to most proposals. More beans, more squash, a proper herb section along the south fence where the light was good. Cole dug the expansion on a Saturday while Eliza worked beside him, and William sat in the dirt at the edge of the plot with the intense focus of a 7-month-old who has discovered that the ground is full of interesting material and has opinions about all of it. "He's eating something," Cole said. Eliza looked. "It's just dirt." That's not reassuring. "It won't hurt him." She kept working. "All babies eat dirt, they survive." Cole looked at William, who met his gaze with an expression of absolute serenity and continued eating dirt. Cole went back to digging. Ben Harder came by one afternoon with his wife Martha and spent 3 hours that turned into supper, and the kind of evening that happens when the company is right and nobody wants to be the first to leave. Martha Harder had brought a pie, apple, from last autumn's preserved stock, and had settled into the kitchen alongside Eliza with the comfortable ease of women who have found each other's rhythms. Cole and Ben sat on the porch and talked about nothing consequential: the spring planting, the price of cattle, the condition of the North Road, in the way that men sometimes talk around things they don't need to say directly. "The town's come around some," Ben said. He had the particular care in his voice of a man who is trying to say a thing helpfully rather than pointedly. "Has it?" Cole said. "Margaret Aldis told my wife that she always thought Eliza was a decent woman, said it like she'd been saying it all along." Ben shook his head mildly. "People." "People," Cole agreed. Ruth Cantor said nothing, which with Ruth Cantor is approximately the same as an apology. Ben was quiet for a moment. "You did a good thing, Cole. Finding her, keeping her." Cole sat with that. He didn't argue with it or wave it off, which was what he might have done 6 months ago. "She did a good thing too," he said. "She stayed." Ben looked at him with the slight, measuring surprise of a man who has known another man for years and just noticed something new. "Yes," he said. "I suppose she did." They sat on the porch while the evening came down soft over the valley, and the sounds from inside the cabin were the sounds of people who belonged there. Martha's voice, Eliza's answering it, William's commentary on whatever was happening at floor level. And Cole felt something he didn't have a precise word for, but recognized as the kind of thing you spend your life building without knowing you're building it. Until one evening you sit on your porch and realize it's there. It was not a perfect thing. It would never be a perfectly smooth thing. Cole and Eliza did not navigate every disagreement easily. She was stubborn in ways that sometimes frustrated him, and he was closed off in ways that sometimes frustrated her, and there were evenings where the silence between them had an edge to it that required patience to wait through. They were two people who had both spent years building walls for good reasons and were in the slow, imperfect process of deciding which ones to keep. But the thing that was there was real. It had been tested in ways that most things didn't get tested in their first year, and it had held. That was worth something. That was worth a great deal. Inside, William laughed, a genuine, full laugh, the kind he'd been working up to for weeks and had recently mastered, a sound that had an effect on every adult in the vicinity that was impossible to fully explain. Cole heard it, and without thinking about it, he smiled, sitting alone on his porch in the early June evening, a smile that had nothing self-conscious about it, because there was no one watching. Or so he thought. The door opened and Eliza looked out. She'd seen the smile. He could tell by the expression on her face, which had something warm and slightly teasing in it. "He did it again," she said. "I heard." Martha nearly fell off her chair. "I believe it." Eliza leaned against the doorframe and looked at him, sitting on the porch, and the valley beyond him settling into evening, and her face in that moment was a thing he was going to carry for the rest of his life without knowing it. That expression, that specific combination of tiredness and contentment, and something that had taken a long road to get here and knew it. "Supper's almost done," she said. "I'll be in." She went back inside. Cole sat for another minute, looking at the valley, at the land he'd come to almost 20 years ago following something he couldn't name. He thought about the morning he'd saddled Soot and taken the ridge trail for no particular reason. He thought about what he'd almost missed. There was no lesson in that, Or rather, there were too many lessons, and he didn't know which one to land on, so he let them all settle into the general territory of gratitude without naming them. He got up and went inside. The hearing that never happened left a particular kind of peace in its wake, not the dramatic peace of a battle won, which had its own noise and ceremony, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from a threat that has withdrawn, from a name, Hart, that had ceased to represent danger and become simply a name on a legal document, filed, resolved, finished. William Hart Mercer. That was what the documents called him, ultimately. The acknowledgement from the Hart family, the court records, the paperwork Cass filed. William Hart Mercer. Both names, both histories, neither one canceling the other. He would grow into all of it someday, and it would be his to understand and to carry however he chose. That was the work of years ahead, not now. Now he was 8 months old with a laugh that cleared rooms and dirt on his chin, and the specific focused intensity that Cole had predicted in those first weeks, and that had only deepened with time. He had Cole's patience and Eliza's watchfulness, and something of his own that was neither a quality of attention, a certain stillness before action, that both of them recognized as belonging entirely to William himself. He was already his own person. They had just been the ones to keep him in the world long enough to find out. Summer came on in full. The garden produced, the cattle fattened on good grass. Cole built a second chicken coop, 8 hens now, Eliza having acquired a reputation among the neighbors for keeping good ones, and added shelving to the barn that he'd been meaning to add for 3 years. Eliza started teaching herself to handle the rifle, not at Cole's suggestion, but at her own, setting up cans on the fence post on Sunday afternoons and working at it with the same methodical patience she brought to everything until she was consistently hitting what she aimed at. The first time she hit 5 in a row, Cole watched from the porch without saying anything for a long moment. "You didn't tell me you'd practiced before," he said. "I hadn't." She cracked the rifle to reload. "I just kept doing it until I could." He thought about the fence post on the ridge, and her wrists, and the way she'd assessed him when he found her with the eyes of a woman calculating odds. He thought about a woman who had survived winter and lawyers and the Hart family's considerable machinery of pressure. He thought that 5 for 5 on a Sunday afternoon was about right, actually, and was not remotely surprised. "Good shooting," he said. She looked at him with a slight smile. "Thank you." Margaret Aldous, who had decided that she'd always supported Eliza Mercer and was prepared to maintain this position indefinitely, stopped Eliza one September morning in the dry goods store and said, with the air of someone bestowing something, that she was glad things had worked out. Eliza thanked her without irony, which required some internal effort, and bought her flour and went home. Ruth Cantor never said anything directly, but she stopped crossing the street when she saw Eliza coming, which in the economy of Hatchet Creek's social gestures was approximately the equivalent of a peace treaty. The town did what towns do. It incorporated the new reality into its narrative and found a way to have always accepted it. This was not justice, and it was not quite forgiveness, and Eliza did not mistake it for either. What it was the texture of a place. The way communities make room for things they initially resist and then act as though the room had always been there. She took it for what it was worth and not a penny more. What she took more seriously were the friendships that had formed under pressure and therefore knew what they were made of. Martha Harder, who had sat in that kitchen and laughed with her and never once asked for the story in the way of a person after ammunition. Everett Cass, who had sent a brief note after the settlement was signed that read simply, "Good outcome." Abigail, his clerk, who stopped Eliza on the street one afternoon and said she thought the whole thing had been very romantic, which was not the word Eliza would have chosen, but she understood what Abigail meant and accepted it in the spirit intended. Mrs. Crowley wrote from Laramie in October. She was settled with her sister. She had found work as a seamstress, which she said she liked better than domestic service because nobody gave her instructions except the cloth. She asked after William and Eliza wrote back a full page about him, more than she'd planned to write, the way you go on when you're describing someone you love to someone who wanted him to have a good life. On the last day of October, which came in clear and cold with a sky so blue it seemed like the season making one final statement before the gray moved back in, Eliza stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and watched Cole come back from the barn. He moved the way he always moved, unhurried, economical, the walk of a man who had learned not to waste energy on anything that didn't require it. He had the easy, quiet authority of someone who had been in his own skin for a long time and had made his peace with it. William was on her hip, awake and watching the window with her, pointing at his father with the insistent pointing gesture he had recently mastered and seemed to consider an extraordinary achievement. "I see him," Eliza said. William pointed more emphatically. "Yes, that's your father." Cole came through the door, and William made the sound he made when he was significantly pleased about something, a sound that Cole had told Eliza once, and the careful way he said things he meant fully was the best sound he had ever heard in his life. He said it once, and he never repeated it, but she had carried it since. Cole took William from her arm with the practiced ease of a man who had learned the weight and balance of a particular child and no longer had to think about it. William grabbed his collar and examined it with great seriousness. "Cold out?" Eliza asked. "Getting there." Cole moved to the stove and she poured his coffee without being asked, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen now. Not thinking, just doing. "First frost tonight, maybe." "I'll bring the herbs in. I'll get the wood stacked." They moved apart to their separate tasks, and then back together for breakfast, and William sat between them in the chair Cole had modified with 2 boards and some rope to make it work for a 1-year-old. And they ate the way they ate every morning, without ceremony, mostly in comfortable quiet, William providing editorial comment on his oatmeal. Eliza thought about the morning almost a year ago when a man she didn't know had crouched in front of her in the snow with a knife and cut the rope. She thought about the word hey. She thought about how much of a life could be built from something that small. From one person deciding to stop and look at something rather than ride past. From one person refusing to assess a stranger's worth by the word of the people who'd tied her there. She thought about what she would say if she could say something to the woman she'd been on that post, holding a 2-day-old baby in the dark of a February night, waiting for the end of things. She would say, "Hold on." Not because it gets easier immediately, not because the people who hurt you will face consequences, because sometimes they don't, not fully, not in the ways they deserve, not because the world becomes just. It doesn't, not reliably, not on any schedule you can predict. Hold on, because the next thing that happens might be a man on a gray horse coming over the ridge. It might be someone who sees you clearly and decides that what he sees is worth something, not saving. You were already saving yourself every hour of that night, holding that baby and staying alive through will alone. But joining, standing alongside, making the fight something 2 people do instead of 1. Hold on, because there is a difference between the life that's safe and the life that's yours, and you can't always have both. And when you're forced to choose, the one that's yours is worth the choosing, even when it costs more than you think you can bear. She didn't say any of this out loud. There was no one to say it to, and besides, she had said it in her own way by staying. By signing the letter to Ida Marsh and going back to the cabin and making supper. By standing at the gate in February without a coat. By telling Cole what she felt directly, because she had gotten tired of not saying the things she was thinking. By doing all of it imperfectly, as it had to be done. Not with grace or certainty, but with the sheer daily insistence of a person who had decided to occupy her life fully, rather than apologize for taking up space in it. Cole looked up from his coffee and found her looking at him and did the thing he sometimes did. That brief, quiet opening in his expression, gone as fast as it came, as though he wasn't quite used to being looked at and noticed. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He accepted this and went back to his coffee. William put his hand flat on the table and looked at it with profound interest. Outside, the October morning was clear and cold, and the valley was going gold and orange at its edges where the aspens were finishing their season. The cabin held the warmth of the stove and the smell of coffee and the sound of a family being ordinary, which is the sound of a life that has found its shape. It was not a perfect shape. It had rough edges and uncertain days, and a past with teeth that would occasionally require acknowledgement. William would grow up with a complicated name and a history that would need explaining, and parents who were still figuring out how to be in the same life without flinching. The Hart family was quiet but not gone. The world outside this valley was not fundamentally just. All of that was true. Also true, the fire was going. The child was fed. The woman who had been left to die on a fence post in February was standing in her own kitchen in October, planning her herb garden for winter, watching her husband drink his coffee, already thinking 3 steps ahead about everything that needed doing, and quietly, steadily, without any drama, building something that would last. That was the thing about belonging somewhere. It wasn't given. It wasn't inherited. It wasn't purchased with the right name or the right history or the right amount of money. It was built, day by day, decision by decision, the 1,000 small choices that add up to a life. Stay or go, speak or stay silent, reach out or pull back, stand at the gate, or step aside. Eliza Hart Mercer had made her choices, and this was what they had made.